you're not just building a home or a house. You know what I mean? You're building somebody's dream, or you're a portion of their dream. And when you realize that and you have that kind of passion and that kind of drive to make sure that you're the best that you can be, the money came.
We are started, Scott. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Glad to be here with you today.
Yeah, this is one I'm very excited about. So we have Scott Glynn, and he is VP of construction at Resurrection Construction. And you guys do some amazing work. You've been a partner of ours. And I think what's unique about your story is, just kind of your approach to the trades and, how that makes an impact to the construction industry. And we've seen this movement about, foregoing college, going into the trades. But maybe I want to start here. From you, what is the misconception that many may have about careers in the trades?
I think just in general with the public today, I think kids are more influenced to go to college, because I think it's driven, in society. And what I found, Brad, I know you went to college, I went to college, but as a tradesman, you can go right into the trade, and within, let's say 2, 3, 4, 5 years, if you have good mentors and you're on a good crew, you could own your own company. Where I have a son, my youngest son went to college, and he was 4 months to getting his degree, and he came in and had a meeting with us in the office and said, "Hey, I've spent all this money, or you have spent all this money in college for me to go to college, and now that I figured out by the time I'm done and how much money you spent for me to go to college, I'm going to make $50,000 a year when I get out of college." And he goes, "I can come back to work for you guys in the trades and make more than that right out of college." So I think if he was to do it over again, I don't think he would have went to college. I think he would have went straight into the trades and stayed in the trades. And I think that's a big misconception today with people is, I wouldn't even say today, Brad. I'd say let's go back 5 years, 6 years, where kids were, or men or kids, I guess we'll call them, were kind of pushed to go to college and get a degree. But we have a bunch of this generation that has a degree that really, they spend $100,000 to get a degree, and then they get out of college, and one, they can't find a job, or two, the jobs that they get, they almost could have went to work at In-N-Out Burger and made the same amount. So
it is crazy.
Yeah.
It's interesting, Scott. I know we overlap just in like mindset and stuff, but different generations still. But in my generation, coming out, it was the same thing. You had to go to college. I would say that a lot of people that I associated with at that time look really down on the trades, right? You look down on construction. Oh, you're going to construction, it must mean that you suck at school and you're not intelligent, not bright. Whatever it is, right? You kind of get a lot of that. And we saw kind of that cultural tendency for a long time. And you kind of have this fine mix of, throughout the 2000s, 2010s, and now especially, you see the cost of college, how expensive it is. It's gone up dramatically, right? The cost to go to college, and then the equivalent, hiring of companies out there hasn't been great. And then maybe a mix of social media in there where people are seeing, "Hey, Brad, I love what you're doing. I see what AFT does. I see what Scott does at Resurrection." And so there's this fascination with the trades again, that people are coming back into it. What have you seen? Because you're, boots on the ground, hiring. I'm sure you have a lot of young people. You mentioned your son.
Yeah.
What's the enthusiasm? Because here's the reality, Scott. As much as it may look nice on camera, you still got to put bags on. It's hot outside. It's hard work. It's not, it's not sitting behind a chair during the day.
It is. And what I see though with the younger guys that are coming in is you're right, Brad, that, they follow you and other builders and myself on Instagram, and it all looks cool to them. And then whether it be, framing, concrete, plumbing, any of the trades, everybody knows somebody that's in the trades. And what I've noticed with them is there's a high amount of enthusiasm in it, more so because I think we have a generation of instant gratification. And so when they can go to work, whether it be a framer or whatever, automatically within a few months, they see the results of their work. And I think that's what drives and motivates them, rather than sitting behind a desk per se, in an office for corporate America, is that, they're there a year and they're still pretty much probably in the same position they were when they started, and I think that is what I've seen with my guys that come to work for us. and friends of my sons and other people that we've hired that are in the trades, it was like, hey, I don't want to be inside all day long. You know what I mean? And I don't want to work for corporate America where there's really no reward. But in the trades, I get to see every day, what my position and what my part is in building somebody's dream. And it's instant gratification, and they continue to grow from it. And then a lot of them are kids today are business mindset anyways. I think a lot of the generation, for the most part, that have any amount of motivation, have some entrepreneurial skills anyways. And they see that, and they all think, Brad, where you and I, we kind of, I can remember when my first job as a laborer. I mean, I was making $2.50 an hour, and it was 110 degrees out, and you better run from the time you got out of the car till you got back in and carry as much as you can. But even then, back then in those days, and you used to get screamed at, but even then it was like, in a week, if you were on track stuff, it might've been a week. If you were on custom stuff, it might've been a couple months, and you went from a slab to this big, beautiful house, and you're like, there's nothing better than this. So I think we have an influx of this generation that, given the opportunity, would go into the trades. You know what I mean? And realize that, hey, I'm going to go to college and spend, $100,000-$200,000 for a degree, or I can go in the trades right out of the gate, and within a year I could be making $80,000, $90,000, $100,000. So.
Yeah, and I want to touch on that. It's funny you give the example of when you started at $2 an hour. I was a little bit behind you, but even in, I can't complain. When I started construction as an electrician in San Diego, I can't complain about the weather because the weather wasn't bad. But I did have to, a lot of the remodels, I was under the house and in the attic. Like I had to do a lot of the grunt work, being the young kid. But I think I was paid like $4.65 an hour, like $4.65. But at the same time, it was good money back then. And when I was in college, going back to California, working on the military bases and the schools at prevailing wage. And so as a college kid, I'm making great money doing prevailing wage work, government work all summer, saving up for 4 months that really paid for the 8 months I was at school, for those fall and winter semesters. But, you look back and I definitely have a different opinion of the trades now, like going into it. So, for those that are listening that are thinking about, hey, to go into the trades, because a lot of people will ask me, and again, this isn't to disparage on like my role at AFT Construction or AFT in general,
right?
But I don't think people realize the difficulty of being a general contractor. And I know you have experience with that, Scott. And where I'm going is a lot of the counsel I give to my nephews and nieces and young generation is going to the trades, because we need plumbers, we need framers, we need, masons, trim carpenters. And to your point, like, so for that younger generation, is especially because this is what you're seeing, and you don't have to say what you're paying your people, but to come into the trades, like, what is that range? What are they making now? And, what does it look like a path for them to learn the craft to eventually start their own business, maybe 10 or 15 years down the road in that specific trade?
Yeah. Pretty much in the trades, whether it's, and I have experience in the concrete companies or the framing companies or even the building side, but laborers today start at $18, $19 an hour,
which is crazy.
It is crazy. And but within it, and if they're good hands and they show up every day and they learn, by next summer, and I'm going to use an example of kids that are coming out of college and working for the summer, by the time 2-3 years down the road, you don't usually get too many of them coming out in the summertime as freshmen, coming between their freshman year and their sophomore year, because I think they're still trying to get their head wrapped around school in the first place. But we've seen a lot of them come in as a sophomore between 10th and 11th. So by the third year, they've probably worked for that same crew or for us as a company. And they've already kind of turned their mindset too, because they look how much money I made during the summer. And now, especially when they get into their senior year, they're looking at now opportunities in whatever their degree is going to be in, and they start looking at what they're going to get paid, and they're thinking, "Wow, I'm making $1,800 to $1,000 a week right now, and now I've been doing it for 3 years." And my boss in the trades, in the construction industry, told me, "Hey, when you come back, you've been doing it 3 years. You're going to be making $1,500 a week." Well, that's a lot of money compared to what they're going to get coming out of college. A lot of, and I'm not saying if they're construction management, engineering, accounting, architectural, that kind of stuff, that's a different deal. But the average student that's coming out of college, that's kind of, I think, is where we're starting to get our influx of new people coming in, because they realize how much money they make, and long term, within 5 years, they could be making over $100,000 a year, and they still have the same benefits. And you're right, Brad. Back in the day when we were going to college, people kind of looked down on the trades, and it was kind of like you thought those were the guys that quit school, high school, or just weren't good enough to go to college, and um, and then nowadays it's not the case, especially when they watch, your podcast or your social media or our social media, and they see the stuff that we build, and they're like, well, it wasn't no dummy that's building those houses.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I see. And I try to take my younger guys, and I know you do the same at AFT, is mentor them and build them up and teach them, so long term, you know what I mean, they're a leader. And I've learned a long time ago, leaders build leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first started in business, I knew a lot about the trades. I have a degree in finance, so I knew how to run the finances of the company and bid my work, but I didn't always know how to grow the company, you know what I mean, and scale the company. And I learned way back in the day is, okay, there's two important things you have when you start a business. If you don't know everything about it, you have a good accountant and you have a good attorney. You can get it to a certain level. And I can remember, back in the 2000s, Brad, I had 50 crews, and we did track work back then, but I couldn't figure out how to get over 500 guys. And so I hired a guy that he couldn't do what I did below that 50 crews, but he knew how to get me to 100 crews, and he took our company from basically doing about 15 or 20 million a year to 140,000 or, 140 million a year.
That's wild.
And I learned at that time, I watched a lot of my friends that we grew up in the trades together, and they owned their own businesses, and they just weren't, and I wouldn't say they were bad leaders, you know what I mean? They were insecure, and they felt like if they hired somebody that knew more than they did, that person would take their work. And I learned a long time ago, if you're a leader, you're building leaders, and you want your guys to be equal to you or know more than you do, and once we did that, it defined my life and my business. And now, I don't run 1,200 framers anymore, but I run my company with the same morals and the same belief I did when we had that many guys.
All right, I want to come back to this leadership thing. I was just making a note here because I want to touch on that. But I think what's interesting, I mean, you said this a couple of times, that we're in an instant gratification world, right? I think all of us have seen that, based on iPhones and technology. I mean, that's just where we're at, especially with AI now. But what's interesting is, where I will say it's very fulfilling despite the hard work, to your point, Scott, is I look back at some of the projects I worked on, even when I go back to San Diego, like some of those projects I worked on as a young teenager. And there's something to be said about, hey, I was involved in that construction in that home, hands on, tools on, whatever it is. And, when you think about the complication of construction, I had a lot of experience in commercial. Anyone that's worked on a commercial project, how complicated that is. Or for a framer, you go have someone build some stringers and a staircase, go have them build some staircase with that rise and run and tell me how complicated that is, especially when you're trying to forecast all the different, flooring, subfloor material for the first floor to second floor and so forth. And it's a lot more complicated, I think people realize. But really at the basis of this, Scott, what I find very interesting is I was at a conference in Orlando not too long ago, and a couple of the parents that were there, it was a tile and countertop event, but one of their kids is going to NYU in New York.
Right.
And they were mentioning that they're paying for it, and it was going to cost them $100,000 a year, like $400,000 for a bachelor's degree. And I'm like mind blown. I'm like, for, to live in Manhattan, live in New York, and for the curriculum and everything else. And I'm just like, you can go into the trades. And to your point, I mean, you're making good money. You're making that every year, and you're building your career off to, with a guaranteed employment when you're done.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. I totally agree with that. And I think, like, to circle back to like some of our college students that come and work there in the summertime, they, that's what I think they see is they see, hey, my parents or some of them got scholarships, for certain things. But if they didn't go in to get a construction degree, they're looking at dollar wise, hey, I'm making way more money. And by the time I get out of college, I'm going to make twice as much or 3 times as much, in some cases, depending on what trade they're in, than they will in college. And it's hard, it's hard to get a kid or a person, I'll just say a person in general, that's used to making $1,000 a week to go backwards to make $800 a week. You know what I mean? Or $1,200 a week to go backwards, because they've already learned with this instant gratification, they've already learned that, hey, if I make $1,000, most of them spend $1,000 a week. And so and to go back to the parents you were just talking to at that event, living in Manhattan, they're spending $5,000 a month probably for a flat, for that kid to live there. And so they go from New York living in that to back here or Florida or anywhere else. And they're thinking, well, there's no way that I could do that. But then they come back here and they realize, hey, I could live in a 2-bedroom apartment, let's say right out of college, for $1,500 a month, or Florida, the same thing. I don't need to be paying $5,000 a month. They realize that the money they make in the trades is way long-term beneficial, especially if they're driven, that they want to own their own company and they have some entrepreneurship in them, that, I can do this and I can learn, but I can own my own company in 5 years and then I'll make, $1 million a year, or whatever that number is, depending on how much work they do. So
what turned the corner, going back to leadership thing? You mentioned that, you got to this point, this tipping point in your career, and you realized to scale and really, create a lot of great company culture and efficiencies in business, the leadership angle, and how, what I think is tough for some leaders that really struggle in their position is maybe they feel threatened if those under them know more than they do, or smart, and there's this kind of imbalance, right? How have you built either the confidence of your leadership team? How have you realized the value of leadership and how that plays a role in, the success of your firm?
Well, I think a lot of it starts with stewardship on my end. You know what I mean? Is that I try not to call the people that work for me my employees. We're partners, we're team members, and I think it would be very foolish on my end and very selfish on my end not to recognize somebody's talent in my company. You know what I mean? Because all I'm doing is feeding my own ego by not allowing my team to grow and to, use their gifts and their talents where they're best at. And so when we hire, and I'll give you an example. When I hired a director of operations a few years ago, he had the college degree, he had, from A to Z, he had everything. But what he lacked was personality and getting along with the people, because he had that mentality is, I'm the director of operations and everybody under me, are, I wouldn't say that he called them peons, but he wasn't receptive to what they do in their position and how valuable they were to the company as a whole. And I watched it go on for a couple months, and then I finally pulled him in my office and had a conversation with him about it. And I told him, I said, what you're trying to do is you're trying to be here and you want to keep everybody else below you. But really what you're doing is you're pulling yourself down by not allowing them to grow to where, or expose and use what their talents are. And it was about an hour conversation with him, but the next day he did a 180 and my whole team blossomed because of that. You know what I mean? Because now he realized that, hey, this person I'm trying to have do this isn't good at that. You know what I mean? But they're great at this, so I'm going to use them here. And the whole company grew, and the culture of the company and everybody's attitude and mindset went from kind of from flatline to people coming in the morning high-fiving each other and happy to be at work. So I think if I was the type that didn't want leaders in my company, and I had to feed my ego and I had to be here all the time, I don't think we would grow. I don't think that we would have the accounts and the clients that we have. I don't think that we would have the culture we have here. I don't think that we would be good partners for not only you, but anybody that we do business with, because, you're our client, but really we're an extension of you. And so if my whole team is on the same page and we're not all trying to be better and to meet your clients and our clients' expectations, at the end of the day, we're all just flatlined, and pretty soon, we become status quo instead of above. And I think in this market, whether you're a framer, a plumber, a dirt guy, a masonry, it doesn't matter. I think we all have to do things to set us apart from the status quo in order to continue to grow and to continue to be a better company, which in turn becomes a better partner for our builders.
It's funny you say that, Scott. I was just, you and I spoke briefly last night before I was heading to my son's basketball practice. And I was sitting there with a couple of the parents, and they were talking about they were going through a remodel. And essentially, they didn't tell me who the builder was, which I didn't ask. It wasn't relevant. But they were just saying, it's a real struggle. Communication was a struggle, right? Expectations are a struggle. Kind of a typical story where things are behind schedule and so forth, and frustration of costs and whatnot. And the point they made, they said, look, in our business, like the way we run in our career, like this is totally unacceptable. Like we would have serious issues and blowback from our clients, and yet in construction, to your point, this seems to be the status quo in some cases. And what I find unique about working with your firm, Scott, is everyone is an extension of you, which, they are an extension of me too, because like you're representing my brand as well. We kind of coexist together as trade partners. But what I find interesting is your team's very responsive, very communicative. They take pride in their work. Site cleanliness is a priority. You don't see that all the time, but I think that's a true recipe why you've been so successful over your career, is that you focus on those details that really impact the business. But I know, having known you for a long time, I know that's how you are, Scott, and that's how you operate. And I would like later in the conversation, we'll talk about some of the extracurricular things you do, because I know that you're very active in your faith and so forth. But how do you create? I think a lot of people, whether you're a general contractor or trade partner, you may have this vision, but as you hire and as you scale and as you have 100 crews, it's hard to get those leaders. It's hard to get people to represent the same value system you have, Scott. What? Is it accountability? Is it financially incentivized? Is it, leadership training or continue education? Like, how have you found success? And when you hire people, to know that they're going to be able to perform in that role, because not everyone can.
Well, it's three things here. One of it is accountability. Two, it's financially, and three, it's leadership. And I spend a lot of time with my team, whether it's the framing company, we sit down, we have a production meeting every Wednesday. We talk about upcoming jobs. We talk about problems on the job. We talk about what we can do to make our company better, areas that we've noticed that maybe we're working for a different builder and we see something that they do and we want to implement that into the company. But a lot of it is, I think, is my guys see how I am. And I see that with your company, Brad, is they don't want to disappoint. You know what I mean? So that they self-motivate in a lot of areas because of that. Because when they know that I'm up at 3:00 in the morning and I'm out the door by 5:00 in the morning, and whether I'm in the field, whether I'm in meetings or I'm in the office, they know that I'm still here at 5 or 6 o'clock at night. You know what I mean? They know that when we have an overflux of work, that I'm in here on Saturdays, bidding jobs and helping my guys catch up. So I think when they see that I'm willing to go to any lengths to make our company successful and to make sure that they're successful, I think it just kind of falls in line with that they want to do it. It drives them to be that way,
It's funny you say that. I think back as a kid, being a teenager, maybe sometimes you get in some mischief, as we do. And my dad's reaction, if he is disappointed as opposed to like angry, like how much of a difference that was for me, right? How I internalized that and how much it made an impact as I look back, and whether it's a coach or, similar disappointment. But I think the willing to do is, you see that. I think I've had a lot of athletes on the podcast over the years, and there's so much correlation between, successful franchises. Like you look at the NFL, right? It's a parity league. I mean, the whole NFL is created to make everyone great. And yet it's, a lot of the same franchises too, they're good year after year. And a lot of it's culture based. And, there's so many layers to what runs a successful organization. And, what I think what's really tough about that, Scott, is there's a fine line in the sense that there's no doubt that when you set the tone as the leader of the organization, Scott, that you're willing to put in the work and you're willing to make the hard decisions and phone calls and put the bags on if you need to, and they see that, so they don't want to disappoint you. They want to lift that standard. Yeah. There's also a reciprocal side of that where they may be like, okay, well, Scott's working, I can't go home yet, I got to keep working, and they may grind and grind. How do you find balance to make sure that they're having that that mental health break, that personal time because they don't want to disappoint you and they want to work as hard as they can.
Yeah. Well, my culture here is I don't want anybody to have to work the weekends. You know what I mean? I want them to take holidays off. I want them to, we give them vacation time for a reason. And, and I'll just share a little story. I got one of the guys that works for me, and he probably works, I wouldn't say quite as many hours as I do, but he probably takes off about as many days a year as I do, which is not a lot. And, and then he came to me about a year ago and said, "Hey, I really haven't used any of my vacation. Can I just cash it out?" And I'm like, "Yeah, you can cash out your vacation." I said, "This year, but next year you're going to take all your vacation." And
I love that.
And his response to me was, "Well, I don't have time to take vacation." And I said, but let me explain something to you. I said, "What if your wife told you that she couldn't cook you dinner because she didn't have time? Or what if your wife told you that she couldn't do your laundry because she didn't have time? Or what if your daughter told you, that she couldn't spend time with you because she didn't have time? What would that mean to you?" Well, he sat back and he thought about it, and he's like, "You know what? You're right." And I said, "Mike, after all these years," and then I just threw him under the bus. But I said, "After all these years, I'm grateful that you do this. But the thing that's more important to me is that you're a husband to your wife and a father to your kids, and that you have extra areas of your life. Like if you like to hunt, you should be able to take a vacation and go hunting. If your wife wants to go on a trip and your kids want to go to Disneyland, you should be able to take them to Disneyland. So it's not really your place to shoulder this company. I appreciate it, and most of them are tough to get them to do that. But then all of a sudden, I have a calendar right here in my office that all my employees come in and they put their days off that they're taking off, and what they're doing. And, and I've noticed over the last year or two, that particular superintendent and another particular superintendent are finally starting to use their vacation time. But they feel bad when they're gone, and I went on vacation this year, over the 4th of July. I was gone for about 14 days, and they did everything in their power not to call me the whole time I was gone, which is unusual for me because I take Link with me just so that I can be connected. And really, when I came back, I had to tell them all how proud I was of them. I got one phone call. We were doing a job out by the airport, and we didn't notify the FAA that we were setting trusses. So as soon as the crane boom went up, the FAA came over and said, "Hey, you got to shut it down." And I just happened to have my Starlink on that at that time, and I'm the one that got the call. But that was the only call I got in 14 days. And when I came back, usually you think you're going to come back and you're going to have a bunch of stuff that didn't get done. And I literally did not have one complaint the whole time I was gone. So that showed me, by trusting my people and leading them and allow them to shine in their areas of what they do, that really it was almost kind of heartbreaking to me, thinking, hey, they probably really don't need me other than maybe sign their checks on Thursdays. You know what I mean? But it was a great feeling.
Yeah, it just shows. It shows the accountability, it shows the leadership, and as you mentioned, the systems and organization that you could do that and be out of pocket for that duration. It's funny bringing up that example because I had a business mentor early in my career, and the point was made that there are a lot of employees that don't take. Of course, we all have the employees that are they're maxed out of PTO, like they have nothing left. Every chance they get, which is fine. But there are a lot of our key employees that just don't use it.
Yeah.
And my mentor said, it's our responsibility as leaders to make sure you're checking the PTO logs, like what time they have available, and not wait until November to say, hey, you need to cash this out, or go take a 3-week vacation December, and really make sure that they're taking time to kind of recharge. And I remember that had a big impact on me because I got wind. This was a couple of years ago on over July 4th, and one of my employees was going to see some family in the Midwest for July 4th. And I heard that he was flying home on July 4th so that he could be to work on July 5th, right? And I remember hearing that and that advice from my mentor, and this isn't anything on me because it was just made known by my mentor. I remember calling him saying, hey, if you fly home today on July 4th, you're fired. And he's like, what? And I'm all, you need to be there for fireworks with your family. Like, come home July 5th, tomorrow night. Like, work will still be here. It's fine. And I think it's really important, us as managers are self-aware in a way of, those that are putting in the time and make sure that they are recharging, because as much as we love construction and the trades, I mean, it takes a toll on your body, on your mind. I mean, there's a lot of, it's not easy work that we do.
No. And you're right, Brad. And I've also found with some of my employees that are like that, that sometimes you'll hear, we're a pretty big family here. A lot of my guys and people have been here for years with us. So we know their families, and my wife is friends with their wives, or, that sort of stuff. And I'll hear little stuff, from the wives. And so what I've also done at times is okay, I know this person's not going to take time off. So I'll call the wife and say, hey, I'm sending a gift card home this to you.
Love that.
And I want you to take him or her and go spend a weekend, away and do, either with the kids or without the kids. And I just pay a trip. So you kind of force that upon them at times. And then, they'll come back, oh my God, I didn't know that was going to happen. And thank you. I don't want them to thank me. It's just like, hey, dude, your mental health is more important to me than, you getting burnt out, because you're no good to me when you're burnt out. No good to our team. And what I found with burnout is that completely affects our clients somewhere down the road, whether it's bad attitudes, whether it's quality, whether it's their health, you know what I mean? There's just certain things. And so when we can instill that type of stuff with them, and we do fun stuff. I know, Brad, your guys go golfing a lot with you, and you guys do a lot of different stuff. We do different stuff. We plan. A lot of my guys are outdoors people, so we'll do a yearly camp trip with everybody and their family.
Oh, that's cool.
And go do some cool stuff like that. So it's fun because then not only is it just our employees, but it's their family, and we all get to know their families, and they all get to know us, and they get to appreciate what mom or dad does that work for us in our company. So.
As you say that, it's funny. What I enjoy about these podcasts is not only just the dialogue back and forth, but there's those little tidbits. And I think back, there was a company I worked for, and they would do the family outings. So you bring the family, not just the individual, and do the team outing. Yeah. And just truth be told, that's something we haven't really done at AFT that I'm going to do now, because there is an impact, because the reality is our families behind the scenes that are supporting their other team members to be at work and put in that effort. And, there's a lot of arrows each of them take every day from just the warpath of construction, and everything. And so it's important to, there's something about the human side of what we do. And I think that's very unique about construction, because there's a lot of FaceTime one-on-one. You're interacting with our clients, with us as the GC and other trades on site. And, sometimes we forget the human element of what we do on a daily basis.
Yeah. And I think even in our industry, Brad, whether, it's you and I's relationship or, our relationship with our employees or clients, you all become our family. And I think when we get caught up in what we do in business, sometimes I think our family suffers from that. You know what I mean? And I'm grateful every day for the wife that I have, you know what I mean? That understands how I'm wired and how I tick. And it was funny, she sent me a text last week just out of the blue. And she just asked me, how's your day going? And I said, busy, but good. And so she texted me back, and then I said, no, I meant I'm busy, but it's a good day. Because what she had texted me back is, maybe it's time to retire. And so I texted her back. I said, no, it has nothing to do with that. And she goes, yeah, I already know how you're wired. You're never going to retire, but it's because I love what I do, but I'm grateful for her. But I also understand, when we talk about work, life, and balance, is that, I have to, when I come home, I can't give my 200% at the office all day long with my clients and then come home and not say 3 words to my wife or my kids,
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a fine balance as the ownership role is that we have to realize the people that work for us and their lives, and our clients and their lives, but also our life, with our families. And I think when, and I didn't do it well for a lot of years, Brad, this I think comes, 40 years in the industry of being this way, that you learn little tidbits of how to do that, with them. And my wife notices the difference. She'll never tell me that I'm slacking at home, but there'll be subtle hints of it. And then it wakes me up, and I'm like, oh, you know what? I need to take a break and we need to go out of town for the weekend. Or maybe we've been traveling a little bit and I realize that it helps me notice my other guys or my other people that work for me and say, hey, you know what? I've noticed that they haven't taken any PTO. I noticed they haven't been doing this, and call them in and have a conversation with them and say, hey, is everything okay? Because a lot of times what I realized, one is people, are dedicated to us and to our clients, and they want to work because we work the way that we work. And then on the other hand, sometimes it's a financial situation in their life. You know what I mean? That we need to be aware of and say, hey, is everything okay at home and what's going on? And I found out a couple years ago, I had one of my estimators in the office that her husband got laid off and never said anything to us. But I noticed after a few months, and she's cool as a cucumber. Like, she doesn't get stressed out about anything. But I could just tell there was something different. And then I noticed that, and she was one of those ones that would max out PTO every year and vacation. And I noticed she hadn't taken any time, and I pulled her in and talked to her, and she said, hey, my husband got laid off and I'm a little worried about finances and this and that. And we were able to step up as a company and one, help them out financially, but two, I just happened to know somebody that was in the industry that her husband was in and made a few phone calls and he was right back to work. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's a great story. It's funny because, when you're speaking about just the importance of prioritizing family and those, not just for you, but for your team. I remember this because a lot of people reached out. I had Katie McDonald on back in early July, and she made a comment, because I think a lot of us, at least me, there's some guilt. Hey, if I'm taking time to spend time off with family or maybe at the gym or something. And her comment was very much like, no, it's actually selfish of you, to not be healthy, selfish of you to not work out, selfish of you to not spend time with your family, because the reality is, like, we, all of us have to be in that best peak performance, right? To lead the company and lead, whatever we are. And you've spoken about leadership so much, Scott, that it's really important that we're making that time to sharpen the saw. And at the same token that we're honoring that for our team and treating them as, as you said, as partners in the company, partners in the firm, and maybe not for tax purposes or partners, but they can be for real life, right? And kind of your example of helping out, one of your employees and her husband, I mean, it just kind of shows down the deep core of who you are. And, why I'm sure you have so many that go to bat and fight for you, Scott, which I've seen myself.
Yeah. It's just, I think, to sum it all up in 2 words is I'm blessed. I'm blessed with the team that I have. I'm blessed with who we do work for, Brad, but I think all that comes from, if I want to circle all the way back to what we're talking about people coming into the trades, that's the drive I think that you need to be longevity in this industry is you can't come in. I've heard so many guys and through the years I've had buddies of mine that have started their own companies, and they were a great framer or they were a great plumber or a great HVAC guy, but they went from the tradesman into owning their own company. And a lot of them didn't last more than 2 or 3 years. And I wouldn't say it wasn't because they didn't have business savvy. I think they came into it with the wrong mindset, and I had some great mentors, business mentors as I was growing up and growing in the industry, and companies that I worked for. But I learned a long time ago, we all want to be profitable and we all want to make money. But early on, I learned that if you just go and do and be the best that you can be and treat people the way that you want to be treated, and realize that you're a part, you're not just building a home or a house. You know what I mean? You're building somebody's dream, or you're a portion of their dream. And when you realize that, and you have that kind of passion and that kind of drive to make sure that you're the best that you can be, and that, this just starts out when I was just a carpenter or running heavy equipment back in the day. But if I did the best I could do every day, the money came. You know what I mean? And I think that so many in this industry, it's money driven when really, like I say, we got to be profitable. But I think ultimately, in order to be successful, we have to have a servant mindset, and we have to have our integrity and our character, and we also have to understand the views and the visions of our clients. And that's what makes us successful in business. And I think that's what gives us successful teams that work for us.
Yeah, I think the longevity is an interesting perspective because there's no doubt that some of the best craftsmen out there, journeymen, know their craft and their trade, but running a business is totally different, right? And you mentioned that, you put in, the company culture, the systems, operation, the brand, all these different things, and the money will come down the road. What do you find, maybe looking back at when you started your business, Scott, and like other peers you've had, other mentors, what are some of the things they should be aware of going into the trades? Like, is it understanding how to bid projects, understanding duration that it takes, labor, manpower, cash flow? What are some of the things that maybe, I don't want to say you struggle with, but maybe were surprises to you that now you feel like you have a much better grasp on to, keep that longevity as a business owner?
I think it's all the above right there. Because when you first go into business and you go from being an employee to somebody, you got your paycheck every week, whether the company made money or it didn't make money, or the job made money or it didn't make money. And now if you worked for that company long enough and you weren't making that company money, you didn't have a job. But I know when I went from an employee to owning my own company, the biggest thing that I had to learn was sacrifice, and learn how to live on a budget, and understand that if I was going to start a company and it was going to be for the long haul of it, and I might have, and I'll just, I'll be honest about it. Back when I started my company, I made $20 an hour as a foreman. And then I started my company, and I think for the first probably, this is back in 1994. I think the first probably year that I had my own company, I took just enough out of the company just to pay my house payment and fuel in my truck, and everything else went back into the company. And I laugh about it, and my wife does. My wife was an accountant at ASU for years, so it never really affected her. But she used to ask me all the time, how do you go from making $20 an hour and doing piecework, so you're making another $1,000 or $1,500 a week, to now, you're working from 5 a.m. till 8 o'clock at night, 6 days a week for $10 an hour. And if I really ran the numbers, I was probably making about $3 an hour. But I knew, because I'd watched enough people go in business, and they're in business 6 months, and they're driving the big lifted truck, and they're pulling the big 30-foot boat, and they're back then, and they're building a $500,000 home, which now is a $2 or $3 million home. But 6 months out of the gate, and I'm like, well, I'm doing the same thing you're doing. And at first I questioned myself, am I doing something wrong? But I realized, no, they were spending every penny they got, not realizing it wasn't their money in the first place. So that was one thing that I had to learn. Two, I also had to learn that when I bid a job wrong, okay, you couldn't go back to the builder and tell the builder, hey, I screwed up and I missed the lumber by $2,000, or I underbid the labor of it and it cost me $6,000 to do this job. Can you pay me the $6,000? I knew that when I bid the job, I better know how many man hours it was going to take, and what my costs were, and how much the lumber was, and my trusses and my hardware and crane bills, because if I lost enough money on that job, it was coming out of my pocket to pay my employees to keep going. So like I say, you learn pretty quickly how not, and I made plenty of mistakes, but you learn pretty quickly not to make those mistakes again, and part of that comes with, like I said, I had some pretty good mentors back in the day, that got me to where I am today. But I listened to them, you know what I mean? And a lot of times they would tell me stuff I didn't want to hear, but I knew they were right. But I had enough common sense and enough wisdom to listen to them. And as time went on, you know what I mean? I learned how to run my company that way and scale my company that way. And I understand what it takes to be sacrificial to the company and to my clients. And after 10 or 15 years of that, then the mistakes become less and less. So.
Yeah, I love that you share that. I think there's a lot of value there in understanding that as a business owner, leaders eat last kind of thing. That the time will come, but that patience is really hard, right? To understand you have to put that money back in the company, and many times there's seasons where you're probably the lowest paid employee in the company, but that's just, to keep the doors open. But at the same time, there's other perks, down the road. Yeah. When you were speaking about just a different mindset as an employee, and you said the word sacrifice, I find that interesting because I remember as an employee, and again, I had no idea about business, right? As I mentioned, I'm in college. They don't teach you anything about running business, And over the summer, I remember I went back to, I was working on Coronado Island at the Navy base there. And I was with the crew. We were doing, some fiber optic stuff. And, the employees are like, can you believe our owner, somehow they found out what the owner was charging per hour, right?
Yeah.
And essentially they're like, hey, that they're charging $75 an hour and yet we're only pay 30, which at the time was $30 an hour is great money, prevailing wage, especially back in the early 2000s. And, but just that understanding that, for having not run a company, you're sitting here thinking they're charging double my rate. This owner's killing it, making all this money, and you don't realize the overhead, right? And as you mentioned, sometimes there's rework. You got to go back and rework things, and insurance and benefits and taxes and marketing and I mean just everything that goes in running a company. And the problem is, a lot of, I don't want to say us, but people have that mindset as an employee without understanding what their true cost is, right? You may make 100,000, but your cost of the company could be 185,000 or 200,000, right? And so it's tough to understand the business mindset when you get into that. And that's where, to your point, a lot of business owners come in and they're like, oh yeah, I have money in the bank. I should be making this amount. I'm gonna go buy a boat, a new truck, without realizing, my bottom line, my net profit may not be what I think it is.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And one of the most important things that covers both of us and everybody in the industry is our insurances. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that people understand, from I'll go all the way back to 1995 from what workman's comp or general
I can only imagine from 1995
oh my gosh, until now is astronomical. I can remember in 2000 2000 is when it really happened, Brad. It started climbing crazy, but I can remember in 1998 I think for 900 employees, I think my workman's comp was somewhere in the neighborhood of about $33,000. And I think my general liability for that same amount and probably at $40 million gross revenue, I think I was paying about $56,000. And then all the builders switched how they did their contracts. So they named you as a subcontractor first before them on the policy. Yeah. So if there was ever a builder defect lawsuit, they came to us before they went to the builder
first.
And I can remember when I renewed in 1999, and I went from 33 and 56,000, and this is the God's honest truth, 880,000 to 1.3 million for insurance for the year. So you talk
10 to 15x.
Yeah, you talk about a culture shock, thinking you're making a bunch of money. And the company's doing great. And then all of a sudden, you go to renew for the next year to even stay in business, and it just costs you $2 million when you used to pay $88,000. It's a culture shock, and thank God we were able to go back to our builders and say, hey, because of this and the way you guys are writing your contracts, our insurance has increased this much. And so on the subdivision stuff back then, a few of my builders, they allowed us to increase our product, our cost on our homes. A couple $100 a house would help. But if I hadn't sacrificed all those years and realized, hey, I don't get to just put $2 million in my pocket every year, that I need to keep growing this company and put the money in, I probably could have been put out of business because of that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. What's interesting, if you don't have the cash on hand, all of a sudden you start bidding jobs and it's 10, 15x, that's, it's a huge change. And the reality is we all know what insurance costs now, and that's something that can make or break you. Yeah. What do you find, Scott, as you work with different general contractors and builders around the state and throughout your career, what makes them more successful? What makes, I don't want to say pleasurable, because, it definitely has to be a mutual relationship, but what makes that relationship good between you and the GC?
Well, Brad, I think I go take a step back, and we talk about mistakes that I learned early on in my career as a business owner, that I've learned from and we implement now. So I would say, we have on the spectrum from homeowners that are trying to build a house by themselves to, successful companies like AFT that we build for. But what I've done for us and my team is, and you guys have seen it with us, as soon as we get a set of plans and we bid the set of plans and we know we got the job, so months before that project even starts, we go through those plans with a fine-tooth comb, and we look at truss layouts and drawings and wall heights and elevations, and we'll go through from front to back of that, and we realize, hey, the architect drew this, okay, but this doesn't work, and then we have team meetings with our builders, and I'll get to the point about other builders, but we already have any problem areas worked out, and then we'll come and have a meeting with your team. You've seen it with us and my other builders, and what we find most from it's an expectation with you guys with us, but some of my other builders, as soon as I call them and say, hey, we need to set up a team meeting, we want to go through these plans, we probably need the architect there. We found some things in these plans that don't work. They're blown away because they don't understand, that that somebody spent $200,000 or $250,000 on a set of plans, and there's a designer involved, and they're a builder, and how can there be a problem? But then you come in and you sit down with them, and you look at it, and they're like, oh my God, I didn't even see that. Or the architect says, oh, I didn't see that. And it just alleviated a bunch of headaches for you as a builder. It alleviated a bunch of headaches for us and for the architect with the client to catch all this before we've ever even broke ground on the job. And what I've seen with other builders, they weren't used to that, And like I say, it's an expectation between my team and your team that we do this. But I have a lot of other builders, in the last 5 years that have stepped their game up because this is what we do for AFT, and we do it with them now. But they don't even realize probably prior to that how much money it cost them in change orders and changes and disappointments with clients. We all know that clients have, they have one vision in their head most of the time, and we have a little bit of a different vision because we do this every day, and it's our job to educate them and walk through it with them. But with my other builders that have never seen that before, they were, a lot of times they were lots of change orders, lots of headaches, delays in schedules, disappointment with their clients. And through the last 4 or 5 years of us working with them, I think that they've elevated their game in the industry as well by doing that. And now they even have somebody on their staff that goes back through and starts looking at stuff in the design stage to try to alleviate some of that stuff.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because as I look at our trade partners, are definitely our best ones, the ones that are that continue to perform so well for us, are those like you, Scott, where, although we have a good understanding, the plans and maybe where some of the gaps are, to have someone who's an expert that's coming in and being, looking around corners and, actually doing some due diligence up front instead of just waiting for things to happen. They're being very proactive. It makes a huge difference, because when you have proactive trades that are looking at things like, hey, Brad, like, how are we going to get the ductwork from A to B, right? And, whatever it is, we all know the challenges that happen in construction, but to have someone that's actually looking at this, for the benefit of the project and timeline and cost, I mean, it's just so much more beneficial for both of us, and it really creates that synergy we need to, build a successful home.
Yeah. And I have other builders, Brad, that, and them, we all work in a small area, even though from one end of the valley to the other, everybody kind of works in that same deal. But I would say a lot of my key upper builders or upper end builders like you guys that we build with, I think a lot of them watch your social media, they watch your podcast, and I think they've made changes in their company based on that. And some of them are direct competitors, you know what I mean? And they know that in the market that we build in, or you build in, and I'm a trade partner in, the clientele has higher expectations. You know what I mean? So I think that they've learned how to pick better trades. I know I have a couple. I'll share a little thing real quick. I have a new builder.
Yeah.
Owned him for 30 years. He's a good friend of mine. They own a couple companies in town, and they were after me for the last couple of years to do their work. And because we're such good friends, I wasn't sure if I wanted to do it, but I chose to do their work. We had a meeting with my team and their team, and we decided we were going to do their work. And so a few weeks ago, my superintendent was on the job with the truss layout, walking the job and pre-measuring everything. And as the house was snapped out, and the owner of that company and one of his superintendents actually was there, called the owner and said, "You need to come out here." And he came out, introduced himself to my superintendent. and asked him, "Hey, what are you doing?" He goes, "Well, I'm walking this house. Here's my truss layout. I'm double checking all the measurements. I'm making sure this all works. I'm making sure that we have the right chases in the trusses for your duct work and this and that." And he was just amazed that he's like, "I've been doing this, 30 something years, and I've never had a contractor do it." And he goes, "And I know how Scott is. We've been friends." He goes,
Mhm.
but I just want to ask you, are you just doing this because Scott and I are friends, or is this something that you do with every house that you guys do?" He goes, "This is what we do with every house we do." And he goes, "We've already built this house in the office, in our minds before it even came out to the crew." You know what I mean? And they were just amazed that after all these years in business, and they build pretty high end stuff, mostly spec stuff. They were just amazed that somebody actually took the time to do that. So,
Mhm.
so to me, I think that's pretty cool to do that. And it's not to make us, pat ourselves on the back. It's just we want to be a good trade partner. So,
Mhm. Well, again, this goes back to longevity. You mentioned longevity. Well, one is understanding your finances and being patient, but it's also understanding that relationship, and how you can be, you bring value to the relationship. You're going to have business for a long time. Well, Scott, I know you're busy. I appreciate making time. Extracurricular, I know you're very active in your faith with your family. How does that play a role maybe in your general happiness and perspective of life as well as running your business?
um, I think it keeps me grounded, Greg. I think it keeps me. We all know the day to day of running a company and the stress that comes with it, and with my faith in it, I'm very active in my church and mentorship and teaching, but I think a lot of it is the calmness, and I think the peace of mind that I have is just knowing that if I can help people meet, know, and follow Jesus every day through my gifts and my talents, that I'm doing my part here. And extracurricular activities with my family. I love to fly fish. I like to travel. I'm an outdoors guy. So I spend as much time as I can in the woods, and as much time in a river in the middle of nowhere as fly fishing when I can. Um, and I have 12 grandbabies, so I have 6 girls. We're tied up now. We just had another little girl, so we got 6 girls and 6 boys. And so to see my grandsons, which are from 14 to 2 years old, kind of to be excited for what I do, and to be a part of our company, and see jobs that we've done, and be able to spend time with them, and just be a grandpa to them. I mean, to me is what life's all about. So that's
I love that. Well, I love that. And Scott, I mean, I can't, I mean, it's hard to say this, but the reality is you're one of our best trade partners, and I've learned a lot from you. My team has, everyone that's worked with you speaks so highly of you, and there's for good reason. So appreciate making time today. And for those listening, where can they find you?
um, resurrectionbuilders.com, or on Instagram at resurrection-framing, or my phone number. you know so but that's really it. A lot of people know who we are, Brad, and a lot of people follow you guys, and we're in a lot of your stuff, and we get a lot of calls because of that, and I'm grateful for that. And like you said, we're grateful to be partners with you guys, Brad. It's fun. It's helped us elevate our company to be involved with you guys, and like you said, Brad, you and I talk, and we think like-minded in a lot of things. And I've told you before, I think just about a month ago, I think I got a lot of energy, and I don't think I even come close to the energy you have. So I have all the respect, and hold you in high regards just for all the things that you balance in your life as well. So,
It's tough. The routine, kids, and no grandkids for me yet, but some way down the road. So hopefully it's a little ways.
but I appreciate
All
you
right, Scott.
inviting me on the show, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
All right. Thanks, Scott.
All right. Thanks, Brad. Have a good day.